Hello everyone, Fina here from Fina Reads. Today with kind of a video of a different kind. It's not a specific book review, it's more a conversation about books with a very specific book title. What have these books in common? Empire of the Vampire, Empire of Black and Gold, How to Rule an Empire and Get Away with It, Foundation and Empire. Sensing a theme here? Yeah, me too. There are a lot of freaking books that have the word empire in them, and I went through all my bookshelves, which is the ones that you see here, and then I have one more in another room. Let's just not talk about it. Including Kindle, although surprisingly I didn't have really any on Kindle that had the word empire in it. But anyway, I came up with, I think, 13 books that have the word empire in their title, and I wanted to talk about them. Given that I don't want this to be a 1-hour video, I will not go into super depth of them, but I thought it's kind of funny to see, especially in the fantasy and sci-fi world, because all of these books are fantasy and sci-fi, how similar the titles are sometimes. And I might already have other words for similar series of this, like gold, or any kind of metal, or the word God. Also words that are used very often in fantasy and sci-fi titles. And I just thought, it would be fun talking about those, briefly showing off my amazing books that all have in common the word empire. So let's just get started because, again, as I said, there are a couple of books here and I just don't want to just show them, I want to talk a little bit about them, and knowing that I'm a rambler by day, that might take a while. Let's start with Empire of Black and Gold. I've talked about this book in a couple of videos now. As you can see, I'm making progress though. We're getting there. I'm reading this book. I'm excited about it. So Empire of Black and Gold is the first book in the Shadows of the Abt series by Adrian Tchaikovsky. The main topic in the series are insects. Well, not really insects. That's what I thought at the beginning, but they're humans with insect traits. And he is creating this whole big world where humans with ant traits, or humans with fly traits, or humans with mantis traits, or wasp traits, or stuff like that live. And it's really an entire society that he created. There's war, there's, relationships between the people. It feels like there's some political intrigue going on. Very interesting and different type of fantasy that I'm really excited about. And I'm about 100 pages in. And it's a bit slow paced so far, but that's okay. It's the first pages of a 10-book series, so I'm expecting a bit slowness at the beginning. Book number 2 in my list is Isaac Asimov's Foundation and Empire, which is part of the Foundation series. It's book 2 of the series. A lot of people, I don't know if you're one of them, I don't want to say all of us, but a lot of people know that there's a TV show coming out on Apple TV for this series. I have the first book actually on my TBR for October, and I really hope I'm getting to it. I wanted to read some more classic fantasy, in particular actually Isaac Asimov, for a while now. So the main series has 5 books, and then there are 2 more, Prelude to Foundation and Forward the Foundation, that are happening, well, before Foundation. They're prequels. But the original one started with Foundation, then Foundation and Empire, which is book 2, second Foundation, Foundation's Edge, and Foundation and Earth. And I think then there are other side stories, but I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, this is a classic fantasy story. My dad actually read Isaac Asimov when he was a teenager or a young adult, and he liked it very much. He read all of the books, like I, Robot and all of the Asimov books, and he kept recommending it to me. But because I was not that interested in sci-fi for a longer time, I didn't read much of it. And I have to be honest, I try to stay spoiler-free for the Foundation series. I don't know much about the series itself or what it is actually about. It's just one of those I really would like to read the first book in particular, and then when I like it, continue. The next one is a darling of BookTube, and that's the reason why I have it in my stack. Empire of Silence is book 1 of the Sun Eater. I think it's supposed to be a trilogy. Again, a book I don't know much about. I just know that people are going nuts over it on BookTube, and everybody who has read it is saying the most amazing things. I know it's a big world. Again, it's a sci-fi book. It's supposed to be a really big world with a lot of political intrigue and great character work as well. So I'm really excited about reading this. This is actually higher on my TBR, and I have book 1 till 3 here in the UK covers. I like the UK covers better than the US covers. And I am actually really intrigued in reading this. I know it's not on my October TBR, but it is really high up. The next one was a favorite in the last year for me. That's Empire of Gold, which is the third book in the Daevabad trilogy. The first one is City of Brass, second Kingdom of Copper, and this is Empire of Gold, all written by Asai Chakraborty, and it's only a trilogy. I have to say this is actually the weakest book of the trilogy. I like book 2 best, Kingdom of Copper, which is rare. Usually you have like the middle book syndrome, and book 2 is kind of the yawn, let's just move on type of book. But in this series, I like book 2 best, and book 3, I didn't like the ending too much, but overall, such a great story. And in general, it's a Middle Eastern inspired fantasy series with jinn, magical creatures from that lore. And it's just beautifully written. I really like the story end to end and how our main character grows over time, how she all of a sudden deals with realizing, okay, there is more in the world than I always thought there is, because she was skeptic at the beginning, and then the more she learned about jinn and their city and their heritage, if you will, the more she actually grew in that world and kind of became more interesting as a character as well. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense. Anyway, Empire of Gold, another Empire book. Continuing in the realm of Middle Eastern inspired books, we have Empire of Sand, which was a lucky find for me in my local bookstore, because after I read Empire of Gold in that series, I all of a sudden had a whole, I need to read more about Middle Eastern inspired fantasy because it's just so amazing. So Empire of Sand has been on my list since then, and I had a lucky day on my used bookstore where it was lying around and I was like, alrighty, I guess this is mine. Again, another Middle Eastern inspired fantasy series. I think it is a trilogy. I definitely know there's a second book to that, so it's not a standalone. Well, which, fantasy. That's how we roll here. But something that I will grab eventually. I haven't read it. It's not super high on my TBR right now, but something I really, really want to get to, because again, this whole Middle Eastern inspired fantasy is something that I started reading more and more since I finished the Daevabad trilogy, and it's such an interesting world and such a fascinating lore with all the jinn and everything. So yes, really excited about this one. Then we have another sci-fi, also a book I bought because of BookTube. Is a memory called Empire. This I know is heavy with political intrigue. Book 2 came out a little bit earlier in this year. A Desolation Called Peace. That's book 2. And this is supposed to be very heavy when it comes to political intrigue, which I truly enjoy. I cannot get enough of a good political intrigue in fantasy or in sci-fi, which it is in this case. So yeah, this has to probably actually move up a little bit further on my TBR. Maybe I should do an Empire November. Empire December? What sounds better? Empire November? Empire in December? November of the Empire? Maybe there's an idea forming. So the next one might just be in here because it has a German title. So I told you about Malazan before, I think. And I really, yes, in my long series video, and I really want to read Malazan. But because I heard that Malazan is supposed to be a rather tricky story with a lot of detail and in general a world that you can get lost in pretty easily, I bought the whole thing in German. The thing in the German books is that except for book 1, all the other books are split in 2. So this is actually book 2.1. And this is translated The Empire of the Seven Cities. I don't think that's what the second book is called, but maybe like a part of the story in the book is called like that. I know every Malazan book is separated into individual books and they all have their own titles. So maybe that is one of them. But the German word for empire is Reich, which is why this is in here. So Malazan, big fantasy series that is also very high up on my TBR. But since I'm currently reading Shadows of the Apt, which is a 10-book series, I'm still in the middle of Dune. I think I kind of want to go a little bit further on those two before I actually start one of them. But I have been wanting to read this since which review was it? I think it was Philip Chase's review on his channel when he talked about Malazan, and everything he said was right up my alley. Big world, a lot of great and fascinating, diverse characters. And if I remember correctly, it's also one of those where where Steven Erikson really put in a huge effort into getting into all of these cultures and different races that are part of the story, and that the books are not in a linear fashion, but that some books play at the same time as the book before, but explain it from a different view of a different race or of a different culture. And that is something that I'm so fascinated by, and I'm really looking forward in those books to get to see, you know, all of those different angles. So another Empire book. Haha, the next one. You know, I love this book, Empire of the Vampire by J. Christoph. Yeah, I pulled that out of my DNF stack. This one is one that I read just recently, and I was basically giggling all the way through because the dialogue was so ridiculous. I am currently part in a shelf space, like smaller read-along group. It's like 5 or 6 people who are reading this book currently. And I told them that I DNF'd it, but I love their conversation because they are all very excited about the book. And, you know, we had a little bit of conversation on why I stopped reading this book and what my reasoning was behind it. They're on a mission for me to figure out if this book continues this way and if the dialogue continues to be as ridiculous as in the like pages 70 to 100. Because if not, and if that was the only scene, I might have to pick it up again, because the premise is actually intriguing. It's just the execution so far was not. Now let's get to the book that I think has the most creative title out of all of the Empire books, and that is How to Rule an Empire and Get Away with It, which is book 2 in this particular series by K.J. Parker. Again, I have no idea what the series is actually called, but book 1 is 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City. And K.J. Parker is known for more economics-driven fantasy, if that makes sense. So I have had both of those books on my shelf for a while because I saw them in the bookstore at one point, and I love this medieval feel of the covers. And when I read a little bit about the series, I realized that it has more this economic flair and political, talking about politics and stuff like that. So it's not typical fantasy tropes. It's really more about everyday stuff in a fantasy world. That it doesn't explain it really well. I feel like I'm doing a terrible job here. Since then, that was a while ago, Ellen found K.J. Parker and read a bunch of books by this author, and when he did his reviews of, I think it was The Folding Knife, and then he is currently reading something else, I got even more excited about it, because even though I think economics is one of the most boring topics in the world, if you can incorporate it into a fantasy story, it's similar with like politics and religion and culture, which I always find fascinating if an author can do that really well in a book series and stuff like that. If K.J. Parker was able to incorporate that into his series in a way that it gets you excited and kind of explains how the world works, that would be awesome. I would be so excited about this. And I really just hope that these are good books because the covers are just awesome. And I think book 3 is coming out this year still. Either later this year or early next. Our next Empire is an Empire of Ashes, which is book 3 in Anthony Ryan's Draconis Memoria series. Book 1 is The Waking Fire. Book 2 is The Legion of Flame. And then we have book 3, Empire of Ashes. Again, one of those. I've heard good stuff about Anthony Ryan's Bloodsong, and then I bought like both of his series, and then, you know, the whole we have a problem with buying books thing. That's how this ended up. But it has dragons on the cover, so I just had to have it. Our next Empire is the Empire of Unreason. It's also book 3. The author is J. Gregory Keyes, and this is actually, I think, an older fantasy series. I've never heard anyone talk about it on BookTube, but the series is called The Age of Unreason, and then book 1 is Newton's Canon, book 2 is A Calculus of Angels, and book 3 is Empire of Unreason. And this is a series that I also found at my used bookstore. Book 1 and 3 actually were laying around, and I got them really cheap for, I think in a box, like a box of books for $20, and I ended up going away with 30 different books or something rather. So this is an older fantasy series. Those covers are so weird. And this is a fantasy series. I only know that it is something with alternate history of Isaac Newton and Benjamin Franklin and something around France attacking England. very vague, so very little that I know. I know nothing about them. I don't even know how the reviews are on like Goodreads or Amazon because I don't want to look it up because I thought that is such a unique find. So I don't know how you are, but I love finding random books in bookstores or used, like new or used bookstores, and then not reading up on them and just reading them eventually and not being spoiled with anything, not having any thoughts when other people kind of cloud your book experience. And sometimes I like those quirky finds, and I realized often these are really the coolest books out of all of them. So that's one of those series here. I have all 3 books here. I love the covers. It is so weirdly, I mean, based on the cover, if you look closely, there is a little bit of, I don't know, psychedelic stuff going on. There's an eye in the person's hand, and you know, there are weird symbols everywhere. There's even an octopus. I'm just realizing now. There's an octopus in the background. So really quirky, and a series that I definitely want to get to at one point. If you've heard of this series, let me know. No, actually, don't let me know. You know what? Don't let me know. Just tell me, should I move it up higher on my TBR and maybe get to it sooner rather than later? Or is this something where like, yeah, no, you can, you know, read other books earlier. Don't rush to it. It's a good book, but it's not that good. Let me know that if you've read it. The next book, I'll put 2 of them into one discussion because we are now coming to the master of Empire in the title, and that is Mr. Michael J. Sullivan. 2 books in this series that use Empire, and an entire series that has the word Empire in it. It's the, what is it called? The Legends of the First Empire series. This is book 6, Age of Empire. And I know it's spelled with a Y, but I think that's more fancy. It's still an empire. And then we have Rise of Empire, which is Rhaenyra Revelations, book 2, or the second omnibus, if you will. So technically this is what you should read first, if I remember correctly. Also, I talked about these in my long series video that I want to tackle eventually. So this is the first trilogy that you should read. Then you have Rhaenyra, and I never know if I pronounce this right, Rhaenyra Chronicles, which is the second trilogy. And then you have Legends of the First Empire, which is a 6-book series that you're supposed to read. And then eventually you can see it maybe in the back there. You have Nolan that then continues. I forgot what the series is called for Nolan though. But a very long series. Master of the word Empire in their titles. I mean, 2 books in one series, and a part of the series is even using the word. I think he has to be crowned the King of Empire. And the very last book is also something that I haven't heard many people talk about, but that sounds incredibly interesting, and that's the Empire's Ghost by Isabel Steiger, or Steiger, if we do it the German way, which definitely has 2 books out today. I forgot what the second book was called. The Queen's something. Anyway, this was a cover by actually. So this was one of those lucky finds that I talked about at Barnes & Noble's. And I didn't read much about it. It sounded like a pretty typical fantasy story with the usual tropes, some political intrigue, you know, a group of friends that are getting together for something welcomingly familiar and distinctly unique. Empire's Ghost shows nobles and commoners alike struggling to survive and maintain power in an ever-changing, chaotic world. It's not super big, you know, we're 400 pages here in the first book. The second book has about the same thickness. So this is one where I get to eventually, and not super high on my priority list, but one day, I tell you, this will be it. This was my stack of Empire books. Do you have books that use a certain word in the title? Like, what is the books that you have, or what is that word where you have the most books of? Is it also Empire? Is it gold? Is it God? Which word is it? We have to find out. Yeah, different type of video. I hope you had fun going through my bookshelves with me and finding all the books that had the word Empire in them. I'm definitely impressed. I didn't think it would be that many. I thought maybe 5 or 6, but no, I kept finding books. Like, I went through in every niche and every corner, and I kept finding books, and then I was sitting here like, why am I doing this? Now I have to put them all away again. Or, as I said, we're doing November of the Empire or something like that, and I read them all in November. No, maybe I'm just putting them away. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for joining me in my Empire ramblings. Thanks so much for watching my video. I really appreciate you supporting me and joining me in my ramblings in the comments, and for liking my video and all that kind of stuff. I hope I see you soon with my next video. Until then, have a great day. Bye.